I'm going to be talking about energy storage and flexibility. I'm joined by Martin, who will be covering solar, and we both come from Everoze, which is an employee-owned technical and commercial energy consultancy specialising in clean energy and flexibility. So what have we got coming up? So we're going to kick off with Martin laying some really good groundwork on solar, being aware that you guys are coming from largely a kind of a ground mount solar background, so really elaborating on that. Martin's then going to pass on to me. I'm going to talk about energy storage, and then we'll stop for questions and Q&A. We'll then go on to talk about the demand side, and again have questions and Q&A there. And throughout those first 3 sections of the webinar, it's really telling a story of growing uncertainty. So you'll see in Martin's early slides, there's charts, there's data. As soon as we get on to things like some of the emerging demand side models, this is as much about thinking points, emergent ways of forming business models, and I suppose there's also partly some speculation as well, because it is uncertain. But what we're going to do at the end is then wrap up and try and digest, okay, so this is what's happening in the market. What does this mean for community energy? And in particular, I'm going to draw upon some of the early lessons learned that we've got from the other part of the Power to Change programme with Next Generation, where there are lots of kind of innovative business models being funded by community energy groups. So that's what we've got coming up. And there's going to be a theme throughout this. In fact, dare I say it, a kind of thesis or at least hypothesis. And that's around, in this new energy market, that the key to success is to a larger extent about being holistic and taking an integrating approach, and that kind of cuts across lots of different areas. It's good. It's firstly about technologies, so we're going to touch on solar storage, for instance. As we move towards the demand side, actually it's about integrating across energy vectors. That could be heat, that could be power. It's about having a holistic view across the technical, the commercial, increasingly the commercial, and also, of course, the social side. So having a cross-disciplinary view. And a common theme that we'll be banging on about in the next hour or so will be around revenues and having a holistic view of revenue stacking. So that's going to be a theme that you'll see throughout. But what I'll do now is I'm going to hand over to Martin, who's going to spend 10 or 12 minutes or so just laying the groundwork for UK solar. So Martin, over to you.
Yeah, thanks for the introduction, Fliss, and hello everyone. It's great to be here today and to present my section on the future for UK solar. So, I'm assuming that you're all aware that the UK solar has had its fair share of twists and turns in the last decade, certainly with an energy market that is constantly evolving. So I wanted to really present this in 3 key areas. So firstly, I want us to get a better understanding of the current position UK solar finds itself in. I also want to tackle, what are some of the sector's big challenges, and finally, how the sector is adapting to today's changing market conditions. But before diving into the future outlook, first of all, I wanted to cast our minds back. So before 2010, the UK had barely hit any large-scale solar farms. However, the industry dramatically changed with the introduction of government support through the feed-in tariffs and also the renewable obligation certificates, as clearly shown here in the graph. It's really amazing to see the transformation that's been in the UK has undergone in such a short period of time. This graph actually equates to approximately 8.5 gigawatt peak, and that's not even to mention also the other 4 gigawatt plus that's attributed to residential and small scale development. But not only did government support was a key agent in this growth, but alongside this was also significant reductions in capex. And this was actually a result of this economies of scale. And it's also worth noting here that capex reductions have continued to fall due to the increasing deployment on a more global scale. But so the message here is that PV in the past was actually a reliable investment, and in fact, it's actually been born out of operations, as many well-built solar plants have generally performed in line or even above expectations. However, this really all changed. With the withdrawal in FITs and ROCs, and as a result, new build large-scale solar deployment decreased dramatically. Short of long-term revenue stability, generators can no longer obtain long-term PPAs with high revenue rates, which has really led to generators needing to try and navigate the muddy waters of the electricity market. So, what are really the key challenges that the sector has to overcome? Well, I felt it would be a good idea to look at this from both an operational and a new build perspective. So on the operational side, taking care of solar plants is no easy task, and it requires continuous monitoring and maintenance to ensure it produces profitable yield year-round. And the emphasis on getting the O&M right is becoming increasingly important as solar assets begin to age. This leads me on to the second challenge. Well, actually, in this case, it's more of an unknown. It's the plant lifetime. Typically, original lifetime estimations have tended to be between 20 to 25 years. But now we're actually seeing some base cases where they're looking at 30 years and even in some cases 40 years. And with this comes increased pressure on owners to deliver on these assumptions. And also, well, what about on the new build side? Well, the UK has been permanently plagued with this inherent mismatch between supply and demand, and the effect this has had on market pricing. And now in a post-subsidy era, solar's exposure to wholesale electricity prices has been a hot topic for discussion, as market volatility and also uncertainty of revenue has affected future development. And also the explosion in renewables in the last decade has also seen wholesale electricity prices suppressed on an increasingly frequent basis. We have even observed long periods of negative electricity prices, which is a real concern for the industry all along the value chain. So this could actually be viewed as great news for consumers. But it's really not a great situation for stakeholders who not only want to see their assets provide cheap, affordable and green electricity to their end users, but they also want their assets to generate profitable returns so that they can support communities and the local economy. And and finally, it's been inherently the case with solar and in the past, and it will be in the future. In the background, the impact of the increasing penetration of renewables, but also the changing pattern of electricity consumption. These require new methods of grid management to maintain secure and stable electricity network. So in these new times, it's vitally important for the solar sector to become more of a grid citizen rather than a grid foe. So now I just want to focus on the operational projects. So in this graph here, this is Everoze's own lifetime extension assessment framework. This was compiled back in 2018, showing the UK's demographic of ground mount solar sites. Again, you can clearly see here the wave of UK solar installations off the back of the ROCs and FITs in the past. However, what's really important to understand here that there were deadlines and before these subsidies were cut off, and as a result, EPCs and developers, there was a bit of a rush to get these built and then also connect these to the grid. So as a result, some of these sites have shown early signs of component failure and also performance degradation. But on top of this, there's also an added pressure of owners who have included 30 plus lifetime estimations in their initial financial modeling. But there are opportunities out there for owners in current operations and even further down the line. So So there's a lot of reasons why operational sites might underperform. So the key question for owners is how can we optimize our existing asset, but also maximize those returns? Well, we need to look at this. I firstly want to look at this from an O&M service perspective. The O&M market has evolved massively over recent years. Costs are approximately a third of what they were a decade ago. At the same time, service quality has improved. Services such as drone inspections have become standard. Also, O&M contractors know what types of issues provide value, interventions provide value, and which ones don't. And also the general scope and efficiency of services have improved. This actually presents an opportunity for older plants, certainly where older contracts become due for retendering. Obtaining new contracts with improved services at lower cost could potentially free up money in financial models for things like proactive revamping, repowering as well, with cheaper and better equipment. Or actually, more realistically, it could give better expected returns to stakeholders. Even maintenance budgets for solar sites were also set at a time when equipment costs were far higher. Given today's cost of solar components, there could be increased budget available down the line. Also, as I touched on there, technology in the solar sector has continued to see improvements. And also in terms of cost, we're now seeing systems being developed at around 60 pence per watt peak, which was really unthinkable a decade ago. So I just wanted to take like a rough example here. So in terms of revamping, so some older sites in the past would have had maybe 100 kilowatt peak per unit central inverters. However, now with some of the new central inverters coming onto the market, we're looking at densities of around 3 megawatt. Therefore, one inverter could actually replace 30. So in the future, owners will be faced with this kind of cost-benefit trade-off to revamp or power their operational assets. For example, after performing further technical due diligence, there could be opportunities to acquire underperforming assets for low upfront costs and then revamp those projects and then optimize yield and create those profitable returns. And what about lifetime? Well, the central issue is that no one really has an answer to the question, how long does a solar plant farm actually last? There's been limited data in this area to provide proof in the pudding type certainty. There are two ways to look at this. Firstly, there's the question of how much and to what extent you might expect to need to replace equipment over the lifetime, and how do you budget appropriately for this? There's the question of strategy. Do you go for a more proactive approach, or like, for instance, revamping, or do you replace on failure type approach? And how much certainty does this really give our future financial models assumptions? So really what is important to note here is that the plant owners must consider the benefit of these opportunities in an integrated way, with legal, regulatory, financial and technical considerations. Also, each plant must be considered on a case-by-case basis, not only due to its design specification, but also its permits, restrictions, and also country regulations. Therefore, the key message here is gaining a deeper knowledge of your asset can save you a lot of money down the road, but only if owners continue to be proactive and agile. So now let's look at this from a different angle, and what might the outlook be for new builds. Well, unsurprisingly, the power curve for ground mount solar follows a predictable pattern. But what is key to observe here in the diagram, as I touched on earlier, is the evident mismatch in supply and demand. It's crucial to understand that the timing of the delivery is almost as important as the total amount that you can generate. The notion of not all megawatt hours are created equal has really changed the relationship that the sector has had with cost and revenue. Taking care of priority one, which was maximizing energy yield and while reducing system costs, with revenue taking care of itself with the RUPs and FITs, is now a thing of the past for new development. In a post-subsidy era, the sector has an increased emphasis on optimizing the power curve to ensure solar generation can be sold at times of high demand. So I now want to show some scenarios that are currently being modeled in the industry and some cases that are actually being deployed. Firstly, one of the simple options developers have is to model solar plants with a non-south orientation. The graph here represents an approximate power curve of a plant with an east-west orientation. So you can see I've represented here in green the generation that is gained from this kind of orientation, and then in the red, some of the generation that is actually sacrificed. However, on a utility scale, there's been little development with this kind of orientation due to this sacrifice in generation lost during the peak solar times. So ultimately, and really ultimately, the financial structure of projects didn't really incentivize this kind of orientation. But another one that is being modeled and is actually being deployed is solar trackers. You know, the introduction of trackers on a global scale has been really significant in recent times, with industry reports actually predicting that they could account for around about a third of deployments around the world. So trackers have this ability to track the sun's path during the day, resulting in peak solar generation occurring either side of the peak solar period. However, like the east-west orientation, model power curves for the trackers have seen some generation sacrificed during the peak solar period. However, to combat this, there actually has been an integration of some technologies, particularly bifacial modules. So bifacial modules have, there's been some research that has shown that you can see benefits of around 5 to 10% in generation. So if we can actually see this benefit, going up for 10% or even more, we might be able to see these kind of technologies adopted on a more widely in the UK. And finally, what's the technical case for co-locating solar with battery storage is becoming an increasingly attractive proposition. The addition of storage opens up new opportunities to maximize revenue by time shifting output to times of high demand. Storage also enables projects to ride through periods of constrained grid capacity, insulating owners from the effects of network constraints and negative market dynamics. Storage can also allow a project to participate in ancillary grid service markets, which Fliss will touch on later on in this webinar. So with the aid of storage, solar becomes a better grid citizen by addressing the challenge of grid capacity. Co-location can help to provide the network with additional security required to accommodate even higher levels of solar deployment as we go into the future. So I felt like it would be a good way to finish my section with an image of GridServe's subsidy-free 35 megawatt peak solar plant that was built at the end of last year. So in this case, actually, it was Warrington Borough Council that secured the offtake and is using the plant to help provide electricity in the local economy. So the plant actually draws upon a lot of the technologies I just discussed in the previous slides. So this site is actually using bifacial modules. It's using single axis trackers, and actually it has approximately 30 megawatt hours of battery storage. So it's really a prime example of what new build solar plants in the UK could look like in the future. There are signs that solar is moving away from its siloed past and heading towards a more holistic and integrated future, drawing on not only technological and economic improvements within its own sphere, but also benefiting from what other renewable technologies have to offer. So anyway, that brings me on nicely to the next section. So Fliss, what's happening in energy storage?
I realised I was on mute, so so thanks for passing on. Something shocking happened in summer 2016. And understanding it is the key to understanding the subsequent development of our storage market. So what happened was this. So National Grid, the electricity system operator, had a tender for enhanced frequency response, and it had a few features. So it was 4-year contracts. It offered availability-based payments. You get paid per megawatt per hour, and they wanted a really quick response. They wanted sub-second response that could be sustained for up to 15 minutes. And the reason, or the thing that happened that was really shocking, was that suddenly from out of nowhere we had the tender was 6 times oversubscribed, and it was all battery projects that secured these contracts. And not only was battery projects coming in winning these contracts, but they were 2 to 3 times cheaper than the conventional energy technologies that would have ordinarily provided frequency response. So in 2015, the kind of installed capacity of batteries and batteries in GB was it was just kind of a handful of megawatts, and then suddenly we had contracts for 200 megawatts, and then that kick-started a whole market. So partly it was catalysed by this really surprising landmark tender for frequency response. It was catalysed by National Grid. The other driver actually links to the very first chart that Martin showed, which was that it came out at a time when the route to market for new renewables was looking a bit uncertain. So there are a lot of kind of solar and wind developers who are looking at batteries as an alternative. So that was pretty shocking. What's happened in the last few years is that the UK now has tens of projects like this. So this is a utility scale battery project. I'm afraid they're not very glamorous to look at. But you can,
yes.
Huh?
Sorry, very sorry to interrupt you. Sorry, I think just there's a few questions in the chat that are coming up around some of the terminology. So, for example, frequency response and EPC and life extension.
Yeah.
Perhaps just as you go along, we can come back to some of those from earlier slides, but perhaps just as you go along to
explain our terms a bit more.
That would be really, I think, really
yeah, sure, thanks.
No,
yes. No, I really appreciate that's good calibration. We'll stop for questions in about 4 slides time, so we will stop for questions and take those there. But just to explain our terms here, so frequency response is time shifting on the matter of seconds. It's really quick. It's our electricity system is operating at 50 hertz, and a National Grid has to manage supply and demand on an almost instantaneous basis, and so it needs to buy services from assets such as batteries to help manage the frequency, to balance supply and demand in real time. So there was a tender to by National Grid to buy those services, and batteries came out as the most cost competitive option. And this is what these kind of projects look like. So here's a photo. They're not very glamorous. They're normally in kind of containerized type solutions. You can see my colleague Nitin there out on site doing some testing. And when we talk about energy storage projects, we don't just talk about megawatts. With solar, we talk about kind of megawatts or megawatt peaks. We also talk about the megawatt hours, the storage capacity of the asset as well, which is why you see it reported like that. At this point, you might just be wondering, wait, why are you suddenly talking about batteries rather than just wider energy storage? And the reason is that although energy storage can refer to a whole suite of different technology solutions, you could have flow batteries, you could have liquid air energy storage, lots of different solutions. In reality, what we see in the market, at least today, it may change in future, but that from a commercial perspective, all of the projects coming forward are lithium-ion battery solutions, which is why, you know, people, although batteries is not the same as energy storage, it is the dominant technology that we see being rolled out at the moment. There's a few reasons for that. One is the kind of track record. So this is a technology that's been proven that it can operate in a reliable way, at least when it's kind of you know, you've got good suppliers. Secondly, there's the capability. It's the fact that you can respond really quickly with a battery, literally within a blink of an eye. It takes about 350 milliseconds to blink your eye, and a battery can respond more quickly than that. And also the cost. So a big reason why lithium-ion batteries have been so successful in recent years is because the electric vehicle industry has been investing really heavily in lithium-ion technology, and we benefit from that in the power sector, from the serendipity of that investment, because it's really pushed down the prices of batteries. So that's why I'm focusing specifically on batteries when we're talking about energy storage. And we have well over a gigawatt of projects installed in the UK so far. And it feels kind of different to renewables. So with renewables, whether it's wind or solar, historically the function's been pretty clear. You want renewables because you want to generate clean electricity. You've got a fairly clear, historically, you've had a fairly clear revenue horizon. You've kind of known that you'd have a feed-in tariff or a renewables obligation certificate or whatever. So you kind of had a bit of revenue certainty. And the asset management approach, when you've got an operational project, has largely been to sweat the asset, though Martin was right to kind of point to a lot of the ways that you can optimize the asset as well. With batteries, it's a bit of a different beast. So the function of energy storage is much more diverse. There's lots of different things that you can do with batteries, frequency response being one of them. Another one being what Martin mentioned, which would be time shifting solar electricity for later use in the day. But the function isn't clear in the same way. There's a lot of options. Also, the revenue horizon is much shorter. So unlike the historical, you know, the past way of developing renewables projects where you had some kind of government support, there's no such thing in the storage world. And actually the contracts that you get are really quite short term. Even 4 years looks long now. It's normally much shorter than that. And also it's something that, because you've got all these different options for how you can use those assets, those batteries, that you have to be quite proactive in hopping between different services. So it does feel much more complex and commercially difficult than the past way that renewables have been approached. And I think, you know, if there's one thing that you take away from the kind of storage world, it's this: it's all about revenue stacking. It's all about your financial model will have lots of different line items when you're talking about battery storage. This is a report that I drafted back in 2016 when that kind of big market hype, that battery bonanza, was really kicking off, and I called it cracking the code and said it's all about energy storage revenue streams. The details of that report, some of them might be a bit out of date, but the core insight around revenue stacking is even more important today than it was even 4 years ago. So you've got a lot of revenue complexity, much more than cost complexity. And that is because batteries are the Swiss Army knife of energy infrastructure. There are, I mean, there would be at least 15 different things that you can do with these assets. So frequency response, we talked about time shifting solar. There are more technical services like reactive power provision. You could do things like, there are lots of different contracts you can get with National Grid for different balancing services. some of you might have heard of store or fast reserve. We've got capacity market. It's inherently quite a technical area, but the main thing is that there's lots of different things that you can do with storage. The question is what you choose to do with it. And just to kind of emphasize, I suppose, some of the complexity here, because this is where we see the complexity in these projects. I wanted to just give you a sense of what that revenue or value stacking might look like if you're behind the meter. So what I mean by that is if you are located with an energy user. And just to give a sense of how that revenue model might look, and we work on lots of different projects in Everoze and have seen ones that look like this. So these are some of the services that you might do with that battery, and you might be flipping between different years, between different months, even within the same day. And you might do things, anything from helping reduce energy bills of an energy user, and there's a supplier interface there as well, through to providing system services, for instance, the national grid, through to other really location-specific services, which could be helping a DSO, so somebody like Western Power Distribution or SSEN or UK Power Networks with their local flexibility services. And you might plan to do all of those over the course of a battery lifetime. So you've got a lot of complexity in what you choose to do with your battery there. And then at the other side of the equation, you've got to decide how on earth to split that up between different parties in the market. So you might have an energy user. You'll have a energy management system provider. So this is the kind of the organization that's providing your brains to your battery, who's doing the kind of technical dispatch decisions there. You'll probably have an electricity supplier, and you might be funding it as a community, but there'll be some kind of investment there. So the nub of a battery storage project is really this. It's how to negotiate contracts which fairly allocate the revenue risks and rewards between these parties, whilst also being able to hop dynamically between all of those green and orange boxes on the right. And that's what we've seen from storage projects. And that's been quite a lesson learned for us at Everoze. Most of my colleagues are engineers that really love a lot of the technical detail. What you find with battery projects is actually most of the challenges are much more about these kinds of commercial questions. So a few questions to think about with storage if you're looking at either doing that in a co-located sense alongside some of your solar assets, or whether you're thinking of having a standalone project, or whether you're thinking of having, say, a whole suite of batteries in people's houses within a community. The primary question is, who will be your revenue partner? So who is going to help you navigate this kind of complex revenue world? And this is where aggregators and also power purchase agreement providers, PPA providers, come in. Examples of these kinds of organizations would be companies like Open Energy or Kiwi, or Flexitricity, or Line Jump, or a newer player, Habitat. These are the kinds of organisations that really specialise in understanding those complex market interfaces and to wrap that into something that becomes a bit more digestible to asset owners such as yourselves. But they will only provide you with a short-term contract of normally perhaps up to 2 years or so. So you still have to proactively manage that over time. So the key question is, who is your revenue partner? And then also, how do you communicate some of that complexity and risk to your shareholders? I mean, if you manage to secure a grant to kind of co-fund something like a battery, brilliant, that's great. But if you don't manage that, because these are increasingly kind of commercial business as usual technologies, the question is how you fairly communicate to people who might be investing in that within a community, some of those complexities, and also how you have a risk reward profile that seems fair. So the kinds of interest rates that we see on solar share raises in the community energy sector in the past, which I suppose might have been 5 or 6%, for instance, for a battery project, that would seem relatively low when you consider the risk profile of the revenue. And so what we see in the private sector is that the return expectations for batteries are higher than for something like solar. And I think there is a communication challenge there to make sure people fairly understand what they're putting their money into. But that said, I mean, I've dwelled a lot on some of the risks and the complexities, but I would like to emphasize that absolutely is an opportunity. There's not just an opportunity, there's a system and network need. Our national grid energy scenarios suggest that we need up to, I think it's 13 gigawatts, if I remember correctly, by 2030. It depends on the scenario that the UK takes. So there absolutely is the need. There is going to be huge growth in storage and in battery storage in particular. But I suppose my advice would be to do your homework, and in particular your revenue homework. And with that, we'll open it up to questions and discussion before moving on. So Graham, over to you to perhaps read out some of the questions, or at least chair this.
Yeah, thank you, Felice. Thanks for that, and Martin as well. Okay, I'm going to go through some of these questions that we've got in the chat box. If anyone feels that the question needs further clarification, please do shout as we're going through them. There was a few sort of minor clarification questions earlier on, just on acronyms and things, but I think these have been covered. So I'm going to start with a question from Fran, just for Martin. During your presentation, you were discussing the term grid citizen. Could you expand on that a wee bit more and just give it?
Yeah, no problem. So it's essentially with what's happened with solar, is that there's been this massive explosion of deployment of solar into the grid, and because of this mismatch, it's essentially the key thing to understand is that this causes a bit of an issue for grid operators. And so essentially what I'm saying by being a grid citizen is into the future, we want the solar sector to not really be a burden, but more of, something where, a technology where grid operators can actually use solar in a way to make things run more efficiently, and to make, it's basically about this idea of ensuring solar it's not really a burden, and more of an opportunity of like being able to produce generation at the right time, but also even sorry, I'm trying to think.
Yeah, and just to elaborate on that, if I was going to put that in slightly more technical terms, you could also say what we're trying to do very often is increase the utilization factor of the network. That's often what we mean by grid citizen. And perhaps a subsidiary point to that is for the kind of engineers on the line, it's not just about active power, sometimes it's about reactive power as well. So there's kind of technical nuances, but Martin's absolutely right.
So, and from a lay person's perspective, really, then that's about ensuring that you're producing power at the right time, so it matches demand and it's able to be used by the grid, rather than overloading it with a lot of generation at the wrong time, which then closes the battery.
So it's a bit like trying to avoid traffic jams on the wires. That's the kind of layman's terms. It's and one way to do that is to try and use a grid connection more efficiently, and so perhaps having on-site storage is one example of how you can do that.
Okay, that's great. I will move on as we've got a few more questions to get through. So from Andrew Muir, are there any comments on major reductions in domestic and industrial electricity consumption we have seen, and what the future might hold in terms of further reduction, stability, or increase?
Yeah. You mean the kind of price reductions we've seen as a result of the corona crisis? Is that no?
I don't mean that. I mean the absolute reduction in electricity demand. It's gone down by about 25% since about 2003-06, somewhere around there.
Yeah, and so the question is,
how do we see that in the future? Is it going to continue or will it reverse?
Yeah, I mean the best source to get a definitive answer to that would be the National Grid future energy scenarios. Some of the drivers of that, so what we've tended to see is the peak demand in the summer come down each year, but there's kind of conflicting how to approach this. So firstly, we see increasing need for electricity driven by, firstly, the electrification of transport that's coming, and what will hit next will be the electrification of heat. So that's going to increase the kind of electricity demand at a kind of national level, albeit that there are important seasonal effects there. But one of the kind of conflating factors here is that because a lot of our solar is behind the meter and it's embedded, sometimes it's not included in the demand figures. So I think that's a rambling way of suggesting there's a lot of complexity, but the National Grid FES is the best place to look. I don't have the numbers on the top of my head.
Okay, thanks, Fliss. I hope that answers that, Andrew. I'm gonna just push forward. We've got quite a few more to get through. A couple from Penny, which I'm gonna put into one here. First of all, can we just have a very brief expansion on what frequency response is, and also what technology won frequency response contracts before batteries did?
Yeah. So frequency response is about so we have lots of different ways. We have to manage supply and demand on our electricity system over multiple time frames, and frequency response is working on a time frame of seconds to minutes, whereas there are other ways of balancing supply and demand that happen over kind of much longer time frames. So it's the really quick stuff is what frequency response is doing. Historically, that has tended to be provided by kind of conventional power stations under under different product names. So for people who are kind of into the detail, it would be FFR or MFR. So there are different kind of products there, but it was conventional generators, and also I should probably add hydro as well. And there's been a small amount of demand response doing it as well.
Okay, that's great, thanks. And now we have a question from Martin from Colin Palmer, and his question is, I think you said that storage can help with grid stability and constraints. I wish that I think Scottish Southern Electricity Network agreed with you. Here on the Isle of Wight, we've tried to add storage, but cannot secure an economic connection. SSEN treats storage as potential generation and quote for the connection accordingly, which on the island is prohibitive. He understands that the treatment of storage as generation is a regulatory matter. Is that likely to change?
Yeah.
Yeah, I think. Well, yeah, I think actually, yeah, the Isle of Wight is a very. It's quite an interesting area, and I've actually had some experience of looking at some connection agreements in relation to Isle of Wight, and we've actually seen where these constraints are, where the connection agreements actually have grid constraints in them, and it has been an issue in some of our projects that we've been working on. But I think in terms of from a regulatory point of view, I'm not the best?
Yeah, so I'm not sure I know quite the answer, but I know where the answer would be, and it's in a document called Upgrading Our Energy Systems, the Smart and Flexible Plan, which was initially published in 2017, but it's the update version that you'd find the answer to that in. And I believe that Ofgem's been looking at the regulatory classification of storage, but I just it's not fresh in my head.
Fliss, if you are able to get that to
Yeah.
me, I'll make sure I share it with everyone.
Yeah.
Keith seems to be posting links in the box, so he might appear with it magically in a moment. But if not, I will share it via email after the session.
Yeah, can I just comment on that? I mean, from our point of view, this is crucial. We are unusual because we are generation constrained, if you like. We don't have enough demand here compared to the installed generation. And that is, I think it applies in the southwest of England as well, but it's going to become increasingly a problem in the UK. And, you know, I hear all the lovely things you're talking about, but I can do none of them here on the island. I mean, I know how to raise project finance, I know a lot about all this, but we just cannot get a connection. And until we crack that, and we meet with SSEN regularly, I mean, we have liaison meetings with them, but they just say, well, the only solution in the short term is an upgrade of the connection to the mainland, which is £8 million. So you get connection agreements saying you've got to stump up £8 million. I mean, it's a joke, but they, of course, legally have to provide you with a connection offer. But the reality is that it is totally unfeasible. And yet I would have thought you could put on export limitation. There must be some technologies which would mean that we could do this and that we wouldn't suddenly discharge the battery into their network at a time when their modelling would say that that was not a good thing. But we can't seem to get there with it.
Yeah, I suppose another possible future solution, albeit it's one that's kind of emerging, is some of the different flexible connections that are being developed, which can sometimes be a way to secure a grid connection at a lower cost. But again, you accept the risk of having higher levels of constraint.
Yeah, then you can't finance it. So you get a flexible connection which says you can be thrown off whenever they choose, and you go to a bank and they laugh. I mean, that's the issue with that sort of thing.
I'm just going to move us on here. I'm just a bit conscious of time.
Sure.
Sorry about that, Colin.
Yeah,
but
okay.
We've got time for further follow-up support with Fliss and Martin. So I definitely recommend you continue that conversation. See if we can get through it. So just moving on. Ian Smith has a question, and that is: the feed-in tariff and renewable obligation certificate subsidy systems have in effect been replaced by the contract for difference tender system as the replacement investment incentive measure. Very long question here, so bear with me. The consultation for the next CFD round includes ground-mounted solar for the first time. Can you please comment on the implications of this for community energy, especially given the fact that there are no size bandings proposed?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, do you want to take a stab, or shall I?
No, I was glad that that's been brought up, because yes, this is the CFDs. It sounds like, so the UK government are looking to have auctions possibly next year, and it's going to be competitive. And really, the question is, well, what can community energy? How can we, get an edge in those markets, whether because of all of the different technologies that will be in those options, it's trying to get that edge. And
but even if unsuccessful in those CFD rounds, I think it's worth also drawing attention to another possible way of getting long-term revenue, which would be through a direct PPA, a corporate PPA, and that is that is an alternative. I mean, that means then developing a relationship with a large energy user. But perhaps, given the current context of lots of councils declaring climate emergencies and hopefully what is a renewed vigour and interest in renewable energy, even if the kind of the formal government route doesn't provide that revenue certainty, perhaps there might be scope to develop bilateral kind of contracts with PPAs. So perhaps it's not that all your eggs are in one basket.
Okay, thanks, Fliss. Moving on, from Stephen Brown, why is battery more risky than solar as an investment?
The revenues, not so much the technology. So you know, if you're looking at, say, you know, just to evidence that point on the technology, if you're looking, so one of the things that our colleagues do a lot of in Everoze is due diligence. And if you look at the due diligence of some of the solar versus the storage projects, with storage, you absolutely can get comfortable on all of the technical risks and have a due diligence report where all the risks are kind of low and minor. But I've worked on some projects where the revenue has been a bright red risk. so the uncertainty, the way that people kind of value storage projects is really based on their view on the revenues, much more than their view on the capex and the cost. So it's a reflection of the revenue uncertainty more so than the kind of capex.
Okay, thanks, Fliss. Now, one from Dwayne, what are the pricing differentials per kilowatt hour regarding the energy demand variation that drive battery investment and solar tracking systems?
Yeah, okay, so you're talking about spreads in the market. Well, it has gone as low as as negative. I feel not comfortable to give a straight answer because it varies by season, it varies by year, it varies by time of day, so we'd need to define our terms there. In general, if we're looking at batteries, spread in the imbalance or wholesale markets is insufficient to motivate a case. You have to stack in different services. So I suppose my way of dodging your question is to say it's not the only thing that matters for a viable business case. It's not just what's the spread in the market, it's what other revenue streams are you stacking in there. But I mean, we can look that up for you, but it will vary by season, month, day.
Okay,
Yeah,
thanks, Fliss.
I was just wondering for a specific, a specific time, just to give me some idea. You talked about things that can bring online so many gigakilowatt in 2 seconds or something like that. How much are they going to get more per kilowatt hour than the people that are just chugging along before this crisis comes?
Okay, so
roughly.
for something like frequency response,
Exactly.
the pricing mechanism is availability based, not utilization based. So you get paid to be on standby, right? So you're paid to be on standby rather than being paid based on a spread in the market. And that's what I mean about some of the revenue complexity here, because some of the services, you have a metric that is basically pounds per megawatt per hour. Whereas some other services like arbitrage, it's about the spread in the market and buying cheap and selling high. And so you're having to blend different pricing metrics into a revenue case, which is where the complexity comes in, which is why I kind of conclude with who's your revenue partner.
Yes, thank you.
Okay, great. Fliss, Martin, how are we doing for time?
Right, we've got 20 minutes. I shall rattle on, I think.
Okay, we've got one more question that we can do very
Yeah.
quickly, and then I'll call it there. Final question is, what effect, if any, will switching domestic customers to half-hourly charging have on battery storage? That's from Tim Baldwin. Yeah,
okay. Anybody who's on a time of use tariff knows it's a lot of fun. It will it was still insufficient based on current time of use tariffs in the market. It's still, in general, and I think this is true across the board, insufficient to even break even for a battery project. So to have a fully viable case, you have to have additional revenue, which is why we're starting to see domestic battery providers work quite closely with National Grid under an innovation project called Residential Response to try and see how we can get domestic batteries playing in some of the ancillary services markets as well, which is technically possible at the moment, but it's kind of clunky. So what effect will time of use tariffs have? At the moment, on a pure economic basis, it's not viable, but I think as prices become more volatile, that could change, and so new business models become viable.
Okay, great. Thanks, Fliss. Let's keep going then. If one of you who's not speaking is able to keep an eye on the chat box, and if there's any just very minor questions around acronym usage or anything like that, if you're able to answer those as we go through, that would be brilliant. And then when we get to the next Q&A spot, I'll take the more substantiative ones.
Yeah, and what I propose we do is I'll combine the next two sections into one, and we'll stop for questions right at the end. Okay, so demand side. So here is where we get to the world that's a bit more uncertain, where we've got emerging models. What I'm not going to do now is talk through the big policy stuff, and I'm not going to talk through the National Grid FES, because what I thought was actually most useful in limited time is to really focus on the analysis, not just summarising what's going on there. So I'm going to give you some early reflections based on working on lots of different innovation projects in the area. So I've been wholly focused on domestic flex for the last 18 months. I'm going to give an example of why I think it's important to have a joined up perspective. I'm going to raise some questions around how proactively consumers will need to be participating in this energy revolution. And then I'm going to go on to some challenges. So early reflections, what are we talking about when we're talking about demand side? It could be rooftop solar, it could be batteries, it could be smart charging of electric vehicles. It could be vehicle to grid, where you've got bi-directional charging. That's earlier stage. This is really a kind of innovation stage. You've got Innovate UK funding 8 vehicle to grid projects at the moment, or it could be something to do with electrified heating and the flexibility therein. So what are some of my reflections? Firstly, this is definitely a higher innovation level. There is more risk. As a result, there are often more kind of grant funding pots to kind of support that, so there's opportunity there as well. I wanted to really emphasize that for these domestic flexibility models, it's about CRL, commercial readiness level, not just TRL, technology readiness level. So a lot of the innovation is actually in how these things are commercially stitched together. It's about the allocation of risk and reward more than just about the inherent technology risk, because things like heat pumps are relatively, you know, they're proven technologies. Same with kind of domestic batteries, and so these technologies are well understood. The question is how you craft a business case from them, and often that business case means it's inherently collaborative, where you're collaborating across energy vectors and different actors in the space. But what I wanted to put at the center of this slide was people, because when we talk about, you know, some of the earlier sections of the webinar where we've talked about bigger solar projects or utility scale battery projects, often you're seeing pictures of kit and not of people. But when you're looking at demand side, actually everything is stemming from this. And I think there's opportunities that come from that. Firstly, the concept I'm kind of working with at the moment is the idea of a place-based value stack, and realizing that you might be in a model combining not just power sector value, but wider local value. And I think this is where the ascendancy of local actors, such as councils declaring climate emergencies, and also community energy can come in, because you might be influencing behaviours of consumers, or you might need the consent of consumers regarding data. And I think this is where trusted local actors can have a unique kind of contribution. Another thing that we really find in so many of our innovation projects is the growing role of suppliers in being very central here. So often suppliers are participating in these innovation projects. So on the example of joining things up, what do you see when you see this picture? This is a kind of example. Probably most of you see a mobility machine. You see a way of getting from A to B. Personally, I see a battery on wheels because I work in the power sector, so I'm interested in kind of portable storage. Other people might see a data generator, you know, from a tech angle. You might be interested in a lot of the data that comes out from that asset. And I think showing or drawing attention to the different lenses by which even something like an electric vehicle you can view from different perspectives does hint at the importance of thinking holistically and how you aggregate lots of different sources of value. Another theme I wanted to raise, or question to raise, is the one of participation. So we had a question earlier around time of use tariffs. That's one example of the innovation we see in the energy supply space. It's not the only example. So we're all familiar with a current model where we all have, depending on if you're on the gas network or not, but we have gas suppliers, electricity suppliers, often that's bundled, and perhaps if you've got an electric vehicle, you might also be using electricity from a wider kind of electric vehicle charging network. We are seeing a lot more interest in energy as a service models. So that's what that acronym stands for, energy as a service models, which look a lot more like, say, a broadband model, you know, where you pay a fixed monthly fee for something rather than having really granular price signals or having a different kind of monthly amount. And there are quite a lot of innovation projects being funded by BEIS at the moment exploring this. We've been working on the Call for Grid one. And under this model, you have a household that pays a fixed monthly fee in return for the provision of energy services rather than kilowatt hours. And normally that comes with some kind of hardware installation, could be batteries or rooftop solar or smart heating controls, normally some combination thereof. And I think it's kind of interesting because it points at one possible future where actually a lot of these assets are controlled by third parties. And there are good reasons for doing that, not least because of the complexity of the revenue landscape. But I think there is a question here around how much of this is requiring direct participation from people and how much of it is really technology led. There will always be a need for people to consent to, for instance, switching to this kind of supply tariff, to consent to have these kind of assets in their homes, to have the right behaviours like plugging in their EVs so that that flexibility can be fully used. But I think it does raise a question, how much actual front of mind behaviour change do we even need from energy consumers? And perhaps that's interesting from a community energy perspective where you guys are quite plugged into local communities. And I raise that as an open question, but as one that I think the sector is kind of grappling with. And then I just wanted to end this section on demand side response by referring to some of the challenges. And this is really based on a set of workshops we did with Future Flex for Western Power Distribution earlier this year. So it's quite hot off the press, and those are some post-it notes from the sessions. And I wanted to show you the industry view of where a lot of the challenges lie with some of these domestic flexibility models, and this was specifically focused on providing local services to the likes of, well, Colin mentioned SSEN, to parties such as that. But I think it kind of carries across to lots of different areas. And you can see we got people to categorise the barriers for domestic flexibility across different areas. And there are 3 that really jump out, which I've marked in a different colour to the green. So there's a whole set of barriers around how you even advertise a lot of these services to consumers. So one of the challenges, if we just go through those boxes, is the value to customers is currently too low and uncertain. Consumer engagement and trust is low. And also consumer awareness and understanding of some of these solutions is low. So there's a whole problem of how on earth we engage households, which is currently a barrier. And I think that's interesting because I think a lot of you guys are actually in quite a privileged position to engage householders because you understand your local community. There's also a lot of quite technical issues around how you measure this and a lot of the data challenges. So we're still working through a lot of although the hardware is relatively proven, the comms protocols, the data requirements is all quite, there's a lot of work to be done on clarifying that. And then there's various miscellaneous challenges. So one around this point I keep on banging on about the lack of integration in the market and how we have to stitch together different sources of value. There's a common one around data control and privacy and cybersecurity. And there's areas where regulation is lagging, though I would add that Ofgem and BEIS are really quite focused on addressing some of the challenges. So that gives you a sense of where some of the issues are. But perhaps what struck me most from doing those workshops is that it always comes back to revenue, and there were so many comments about the value and people being concerned that at present it is too low, it's too uncertain, it's not pricing in carbon, it's too short term, it's hard to stack. It always comes back to revenue. I was going to stop for questions there, but what I'm going to do is just whiz through my last 5 slides or so before we open it up to questions. And here I really want to talk about, okay, so what does this mean for a community energy perspective? And I do this in a humble way because you guys are the experts here, but it's at least some thoughts or interim takeaways from having worked on some projects. So, and there are 5. First one, these new models in this new energy future are incredibly diverse. They're not consolidated. We're seeing EV car clubs. We're seeing peer-to-peer trading. We're seeing domestic flexibility models, electrified heating. You know, it's really diverse. We're seeing an explosion of ideas. Will all of it work? No. We've got this great portfolio of experiments going on. We don't know which models are going to work. We need to accept that some of them are going to fail. And we also need to accept that it's a more complex future. And there probably won't just be one winning model. There'll be lots of different models out there. But it sure looks different from the early days of community energy, where stuff was fairly consolidated around a solar model, solar feed-in tariff model. Secondly, that a lot of these community energy models in this new energy future require a lot of resource during operations and less effort perhaps upfront. We're seeing a tipping of the seesaw. And the implication there, I think there's implications for organisational development and perhaps needing to have a greater customer-facing contingent within organisation, because there may be more operational headaches to deal with. Thirdly, a lot of these models are complex with real revenue risk, but actually the plus side is that the capex risk is lower as well. So the profile of the piggy bank risk, the financial risk, it does look different. And as I've said before, I think there are implications here in terms of bringing partners on board, whether it's advisors or whether you outsource it fully to a third party. And perhaps there's also arguments here to really chase de-risking grants to deal with some of that revenue risk, but it is all about revenue. Fourthly, it's about articulating, I think, where community energy can have a real unique selling point, USP, and not just be seen as the cheap option. And I think that is the badge of success. I think the strongest models that I've seen coming through in next generation are really the ones that leverage community energy groups' privileged position in terms of having the trust of a community. I think when we're having a sector going through such dramatic change, and where it's getting personal because it's hitting people's homes, then actually having organisations that are local that guide you through that could really help to make this transition happen. And I think, yeah, local community groups have got a unique role and position to play there. It's not just about being, using volunteer. In fact, it's not about that at all. It really is about that local trust. And fifthly, this is kind of quoting Simon Roberts at the CSE anniversary, 40th anniversary last summer. But it's all about laying the tracks as we go. This is an evolving space. We need to learn and adapt. It's not just about having a rigid plan, and we need to be agile given the uncertain picture, which I think community energy groups, I've always been impressed, are very good at doing this. So those are my takeaways. It's about diversity. It's about greater resources during operations. It's about engaging with some really meaty revenue questions and perhaps trying to outsource some of that to the private sector. It's about really leveraging that USP of being local and trusted and adapting as we go. But fundamentally, it's also about having a holistic approach. It's about joining those different bits of the jigsaw puzzle together as we start to see the energy system in a more holistic way. And with that, I'll open it up to questions.
Fantastic, thanks, Fliss. Got a few minutes left. I think we can run over, but if anyone has engagements to get away to, please do just drop off. I will make sure the recordings are available, as I mentioned before. So from the chat box, we have one from Ian Smith asking, how does a fixed price volume independent EAS model deter waste?
Yeah, so you're saying if you have a fixed price energy as a service model, how do you stop a consumer from just wasting energy or being very inefficient in energy use? Yeah, good question. I suppose what some of the tech providers are doing are trying to use kind of nudge theory and behavioral economics. And I think a lot of the innovation projects are grappling with that very question, and they're trying to collect data on how consumers respond when their bills look quite different in their structure. So I think it's something that people are exploring. I don't think they've got a fixed answer, but there are live trials kind of probing that very question. Okay, it's a good question.
Do we have any other questions from anyone? Feel free to unmute yourselves and ask verbally as well. Okay, great. None for the time being. We had a good Q&A session halfway through there. It looks like we got through all of them. Well, thanks, Fliss and Martin, for a very insightful and interesting webinar. As I mentioned at the start, to everyone else, if you've got any further questions or specific issues that you're tackling with your group and you want these answered, please do get in touch with myself or Megan, and then and we can get you guys in touch with Felicity and Martin.
Yeah, and could I just ask as a request, we would be really grateful for any feedback you have on this, because I'll be honest, it's quite an intimidating and challenging thing to do, to come up with a kind of webinar that is, you know, open to people who are both really perhaps new to some of these concepts, but also some people who are really well into the detail. So, you know, we're always keen to learn and improve. So any feedback you've got on how we can do a better job in future, I'd be really grateful, and I'm sure Martin would be too, because I'm keen to improve.
Okay, thanks, Fliss. I will email everyone with with follow-up details on from this, and if anyone has any feedback, please do send it to me, and I'll pass it on.
Good, thank you.
Okay, right. Thank you, everyone, very much for joining, and I will be speaking to you via email very shortly. Thanks all.
Thank you.
Graham.
Bye.
Thanks
Bye.
again, Martin, Fliss.
Everyone.
Thanks, Martin.